Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Central Business District, which is going to be central to our discussion about urban land use. See what I did there? So let's go ahead and start out with a definition. Here we go. Central Business District, or CBD, is the downtown or nucleus of an urban area. It is marked by, and these are the characteristics, and you want to make sure that you remember these. These are of vital importance. It is marked by high density land use, high land values, the convergence of mass transit systems, the tallest buildings, and is traditionally the major concentration of retail, office, and cultural activities. So typically, these CBDs are going to be fairly compact. They're going to be relatively small. So think about, for example, where it would be in the Las Vegas Valley. And really kind of what it would be is on the south side, like the 215 at Las Vegas Boulevard, so the south end of the strip, all the way up to Las Vegas Boulevard on the north side at like the 95. So, and then running the whole length of the 15. So it's really kind of the strip plus the central part of Las Vegas, which is where you're going to find more of the office and governmental activities, things like that. And so that's the area that we're talking about. It's fairly compact. When you look at the whole of the Las Vegas Valley, that's just a small corridor of it. But it's a really central part of, it's a really important corridor. All right, easily accessible. You can get there from all three of our major freeways, the 215, the I-15, and the 95. You can access it from all of those areas. In addition to that, we have a monorail that runs there. We have the airport that is directly adjacent to it. So all of these things are really, really important. Land values are very, very high because there's a lot of competition for that land value. And so what ends up happening in these CBDs is that there's very intensive land use. What they described as high density land use, so a lot of people packed in there. In this case, we're talking about a lot of space being used up. So there's not a lot of just open, empty space down on the strip. So in order to maximize the space that they have, they're going to build up. So a lot of times CBDs, especially in North America, are characterized by skyscrapers. All right, because that allows for the land to be used most intensively. All right. Now, typically when we have, we're going to stray away from Las Vegas for a second, and in typical CBDs, when you see a lot of skyscrapers, the skyscrapers are used intensively. So the higher foot traffic areas, the areas that tend to need higher range and higher threshold services are going to be on the bottom, so typically that is commercial. Then you're going to have offices in the middle and sometimes residential on top. So a lot of times the things that we tend to see in central business districts are high threshold retail services. So let's take a moment and remember, what is threshold? Take a moment, define threshold. Remember that that is the minimum number of people needed to maintain a service. All right. So services that need, or businesses that need a lot of people, are going to locate in a CBD because there's going to be a lot of people there. And they're going to have high range services. So services that people are willing to travel a long distance for are going to cluster there as well. A lot of times they provide services for office workers down in those areas. It might be things regarding filing of paperwork, delivery of paperwork. It might be a whole host of different things that might be related to office work. Financial institutions might be clustered down there, different things like that. A lot of times we see other services that are related to the operation of these different office activities, governmental activities, so financial, legal, other services there, because that increases efficiency, and that's a good example of agglomeration, clustering together to help increase efficiency. And then finally, oftentimes see a lot of public services, so governmental services down there. And that's where that northern part of Las Vegas Boulevard kind of fits that bill, because that's where you're going to see City Hall. That's where Las Vegas City Hall. That's where you're going to see the Regional Justice Center, where our courts are located. That's where you're going to see the federal courthouse, different things like that. So that's all clustered in that area because it requires, to be highly accessible. And a lot of times other industries aren't going to be able to afford the very high land values. And so that's another reason for it. Now, what we have been describing are central business districts that are characteristic of North America. North American central business districts are characterized by skyscrapers and very intensive land use. And relatively few people live downtown because those land values are so expensive that in order to live down there, the rent is going to be remarkably high. For example, my brother-in-law still does live in New York City, and when he first moved out there, lived in the financial district, which is the CBD of all CBDs in North America. And he lived at the top of a skyscraper. It was a great view, but it was a fairly small apartment, and his rent was something like $3,000 a month, which is more than a lot of mortgages to own a home out here in Nevada. And the reason for that is because the land was so expensive in downtown Manhattan, the financial district of Manhattan, in New York City. There was so much competition for that space that those rents could be that high. All right? And people were still willing to pay that. All right? But because those rents are so high, relatively few people live in those downtown areas. All right? A lot more people live in the areas away from the central business district. Now, we're going to talk more about residences and things like that a little bit later. So we're going to explain how apartments fit into this and things like that. We tend to see relatively new structures in North American CBDs. There aren't a ton of parks, all right? Fairly limited. New York City is, I would say, kind of a counterexample to that. If you think about the Las Vegas Strip, how many open green areas are there? All right. There's not a lot of supermarkets because there aren't as many people needing those day-to-day services. You're not going to see a lot of barbershops. You're not going to see a lot of those types of things that cater to people's everyday residential needs. Right? And instead, what you're going to see a lot more of are a lot more cars. Okay, because people will live away from the central business district and commute in. So you're going to see a lot of traffic and things like that. And, think of the Las Vegas Strip. The Las Vegas Boulevard, very, very crowded, very, very packed. Hey, think of, the 215, the 95, the I-15 around our central business district. There's a lot of cars. Okay, it's very, very busy. Okay, now, European central business districts, and honestly, most central business districts from around the world aren't very much like the CBDs in North America. CBDs in North America are kind of unique. So when we start talking about urban land use in North America, we're going to see why there are North American models and there's international models. So European CBDs a lot of times have very low-rise buildings in their CBDs, and that skyscrapers will be further off. More people tend to live downtown, and people with more money are trying to get in downtown. So you tend to see more affluent areas in the interior part, whereas that's not necessarily the case in North America. And we'll talk about that more in class because it can be rather confusing. All right. We tend to see older structures, so those areas that are maintained, for example, downtown London, right around the central business district of London, you have the Westminster Abbey. And that is a building that dates back to 1,000 years. It's remarkably old and has been maintained. And the rest of the city has built up around it, but it's still there. It's still preserved. Okay? We see more parks. We see areas that cater to everyday residential because there's more people living there. All right? And because people are living there and because those services are more clustered, we're also going to see that there are fewer cars in those areas because people are able to walk to more places. But in addition to that, there's actually an explanation as to why, because those streets are more narrow because they were built much longer ago prior to the invention of automobiles. And so even if you go back to the East Coast and you go back to Boston and you go back to New York City and you go back to Philadelphia and you look at some of these cities that are much older, that predate the invention of automobiles, you're going to see a similar setup there as well. Now, things have changed over time and have kind of adapted to personal automobiles, especially here in North America. We'll explain why that is as we continue going on. So let's take a look. For example, this is the one that I was just talking about. This is the financial district in New York City. This is downtown Manhattan. And this is what I describe as the CBD of all CBDs in North America. This is the most characteristic example. And what do you see? What types of buildings do you see when you look down here? You're seeing high rises. All right. And so again, on the bottom floor of those high rises, you're going to be seeing more high range, high threshold services, especially high threshold services. On the lower end, a lot of foot traffic, a lot of people down there. As you move further up, you have fewer and fewer people that have to access those. And by the time you get to the very top, the residential, it's very few people that are accessing. It's just the people that are living there. And so it's about convenience. It's about how accessible it is. And so we're going to talk about that here in just a couple minutes. Hey, but this is a great example of what we see, in New York City. They have a ton of public transportation to help facilitate more and more people. And it's part of the way that they've adapted to the fact that the city is a bit older and the fact that it predates automobiles. So there are some elements to this. It's really, really fascinating when you look at the specific characteristics of each individual city as you go. And so the next one that I would like to use is Paris. It was so fascinating. When we were in Paris a few years ago, we went to the very top of the Eiffel Tower and we looked around, and it is the tallest building by far in all the area that is around it. It's really and truly remarkable. And as you can see in this image, the skyscrapers, the high-rises, are much further off in a completely different district of Paris. Now, part of the reason for that is actually by law. In 1973, there was a building that was completed that topped 600 feet tall. And there was such an outcry in Paris about it being a blight on the cityscape that in 1974, the very next year, Paris placed a restriction on the number of buildings, or on the height of buildings within this district. And so you can see there the impact of that. Now, that law has since expired and is no longer in place. I think it ended in like 2011. Okay? And so it'll be interesting to see in the future how things change. But take a look at this picture. Take a look at the development of Paris as a city and how there's really not a lot of high-rises in their central business district. That all those other areas, all those high-rises are further removed from the city center. Now, one of the things that we talked about with regards to North American CBDs is the lack of supermarkets because relatively few people live in those downtown CBDs. Now, there is an element of exception to that, as with just about everything that we talk about. Because in a lot of CBDs, you're going to see the residential pattern or the types of residences that are used are apartments. Because that will pack more people into an area where land values are higher, that thereby diffusing the cost across multiple families in a single area, keeping those rents a little bit lower. Now, that's a little bit different than with a high-rise, but similar concept. But still, we see a lot of people packed into the areas immediately surrounding the central business district because of things like apartment buildings. And we don't see the same kind of access to services, residential services, like supermarkets. And that creates what we tend to see are food deserts, an area characterized by a lack of affordable, fresh, and nutritious food. And when we take a look at this image here in just a minute, what you're going to notice is that the extremely rural areas are subject to this. And in particular, areas immediately surrounding the central business district. All right. And in addition to that, it's not just about distance either. It's also about how you have access to it. Because people that are living near a city center lot of times don't have a car because, one, they may not need it because they can walk from place to place, or they may not be able to afford it. So we're going to see other modes of transportation. So you're going to see a lot more public transportation, whether those are subways, whether those are taxis, things like Uber and Lyft, whether that is public transportation like buses. Hey, we're going to see different modes of transportation. So you don't have the same private use of transportation. And so you also have to take that into consideration. So when we take a look at this, first off, let's ask the question, what type of map are we looking at, and at what scale are we analyzing this? And this is looking at having no car and no supermarkets within a 1 mile of your residence. Okay? And so areas that are especially rural, subject to that. Hey, but also, and this can be kind of misleading on maps like this, is like when we take a look at Clark County, the central business district is fairly compact. And so the areas immediately surrounding the central business district might be subject to being a food desert, whereas the rest of the county, because that's the scale that we're looking at here, we're looking at the county scale, the rest of the county may not have that same problem because you're also talking about the suburbs. So Clark County can be kind of a misleading example on this particular map, suggesting that not very many people are subject to being in a food desert, where the reality is it might be more prevalent in inner city areas than it is in suburban areas, all within the same county. So now let's go ahead and start explaining why these different types of things happen. And in order to do that, we're going to introduce a couple vocabulary terms. First being functional zonation. The definition is the division of a city into different regions or zones. The example they give is residential or industrial. For certain purposes or functions. Example being housing or manufacturing. Hey, essentially what functional zonation is that different zones serve different functions. All right? Residential zones are to house people. Industrial zones are for manufacturing. Commercial zones are for sales and services. All right? And that kind of makes sense. But by identifying regions within a city where that is possible, okay, or where that occurs, then we can create specific laws about maintaining that. Now, that's going to be important because think back to the urban game that we played in class. Think back to the way that your city developed. Did you have an industrial zone? Did you have a residential zone? Did you plan it out? And so that is going to be really, really important as cities continue to develop, is to have a plan. And that's essentially what functional zonation is that there is a plan for the city as it continues to grow. Then, as this plays out, we're going to see laws that are created to basically codify that, to put into writing, to put into law these different activities. Now, what that ends up meaning is that certain activities aren't very likely to be found in a central business district. Like you're not likely to find manufacturing in a central business district because the land values are too expensive. Okay? According to Weber and his least cost theory, industries are looking to minimize their costs. And because of the high amount of competition for land values in a central business district, manufacturers are going to be like, I'm out. I'll move someplace else where the land values are lower, further away. All right? And in the same vein, residential is going to be too expensive in a central business district for most people to live there. And even the people that live there, they're going to live further up where the land values or the rents are a little bit cheaper because that area is less accessible with certain exceptions. Okay? Now, functional zonation gives way to zoning laws. Okay? So the fact that there are different zones of the city that are going to serve different functions, now we can actually put that into law. We can codify that, okay, by putting it into law. Legal restrictions on land use that determine what types of buildings and economic activities, different functions, are allowed to take place in certain areas, different zones. So there's the connection there between functional zonation. Okay, functional zonation is just that it takes place in different areas. Zoning laws are the legal restrictions to where it can take place. In the United States, areas are most commonly divided into separate zones of residential, retail, sometimes seen as commercial, or industrial use. And there's a lot of different municipalities are going to have different language that they use. And the whole idea behind this is that, would you as a resident want to live next to a factory, or would you want a factory to be built right next to your house? Well, probably not. And so that's the reason for this, is there's legal restrictions, and we say, okay, this zone is going to serve this function, and it's going to be away from everything else. And then there's different levels of this. We say industrial use, but it might be heavy industrial, it might be light industrial, it might be mixed use. So there's a lot of different classifications, and it depends on your municipality. So let's take a look at our municipality. This is an example of GIS that is put together by the city of Henderson, Nevada, to look at zoning laws in different areas. So they divide up these different areas. This is in particular, if you take a look at this, looking at the area immediately surrounding Coronado High School. Okay, so that green that you see just off of center, that's Coronado High School. All right, and so the area that is highlighted on this GIS is looking at the residential area that is immediately across Coronado Center from our high school. All right. And it's a Choropleth map with lots of different classes. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, you can actually go on the City of Henderson website and look at all of this data. It's really, really interesting. But in addition to just having residential, like I mentioned with industrial, there's heavy industrial, there's light industrial. There's also different elements of residential. In this case, the area that is selected is characterized as medium density residential. How do they characterize that? Well, if you take a look a little bit closer, what you can see is that they characterize how many dwellings can take place or can reside in each area. So the area immediately across from Coronado High School is characterized as medium density residential 10. And then they have in parentheses 10 DU per AC. What that means is 10 dwelling units per acre. So you're going to see more houses closer together, and that is written by law. If you take a look at the area that is right behind Coronado High School that has the apartments, you're going to see that's even higher. That's medium density, 16 dwelling units per acre. And so you can actually take a look at this. And as a result, we're talking about the space in the backyard, hey, how close you are to your neighbors. All these different things are elements that are written into law that govern our residential area. So it's really, really fascinating to take a look at this and to kind of figure out, okay, what's happening in these areas. Now, part of the explanation for this is a theory called bid rent. And essentially what bid rent is that the value of the land is reflective of how useful it is. So, land that is more useful to more people is thus going to be more expensive. So, areas that are near the central business district, that are very, very accessible to lots and lots of people, are going to be the areas that are the most expensive, which explains why central business districts are what they are. Is this whole theory behind bid rent. Now, as you get further away from the city center, that land is going to be less useful to fewer people. So, factories still need to be close to transportation systems. We talked about that with Weber, so they're going to be a little bit closer. Hey, warehousing, when you're just storing stuff, that might be further away. Residential, which really only has to be useful to you and your family, is going to be the furthest out. And so that is a reflection of this theory of bid rent. And we said the same thing during our discussion of von Thunen as well. We said that the concentric rings of von Thunen's model were representative of how useful that land was and how much competition for that land there would be. So the closer you are to the city center, the more useful that land is to more people, and that drives up land values. Now, what then we end up seeing is that there are different patterns of housing taking place in different areas, okay? And so we have to understand different types of housing and essentially what service or what function they serve, okay, in this grand scheme of things, okay? So if you notice here in the graphic, okay, at the center point, okay, where our two axes come together, we have the central business district. And then you have along the x-axis, you have the distance from the city center, and along the y-axis is going to be population density. So essentially what we're seeing is that population density is a little bit lower in the central business district because it's fairly expensive to live there, so residential is going to be lower. Immediately outside the central business district, we're going to see fairly high population density, mainly because the types of houses we're going to see are apartments, which are going to get lots of families into very close proximity there. More dwelling units per acre, to use the vocabulary from the city of Henderson. And as you get further away from the city center, as you get further out into the suburbs, you're going to see lower population density, fewer people living further apart. So lower density, lower concentration, further out. And you're going to see different types of houses utilized in those different areas. So let's take a look at those. Now, what you see in the top left there is an apartment building. Okay, now, I don't know that I need to necessarily show you what an apartment building is, but let's understand what this does. Okay, because you're getting more dwelling units per acre, you get more families close together. And because they are closer to the city center, where the land values are, according to bid rent, more expensive, this diffuses the cost across multiple families. More people keeps those costs a little bit lower, so more people are able to afford it. And as you move further out, we're going to see lower population densities. Land values, now remember, we have to talk about comparing apples to apples. So, a quarter acre, a half acre, a full acre, whatever it is. Okay? A full acre closer to the city is going to be more expensive than a full acre out in a residential area, okay, or out in a suburban area. Okay? What you see in the bottom right are row houses, okay? Individual dwelling units, but very close together. Okay? High density, high concentration. Not as high density as high concentration as an apartment building. But that's what we're going to notice. As we move further out, it's lower density, lower concentration. The next example you see in the top left there is a duplex. A duplex is basically, it kind of looks like a single house, but notice what you got there. You got two front doors. So you have two families. So it's kind of like a row house in that they're kind of like attached, they're next to each other. But it's that by itself is just a single building. And then you might have another duplex next to it. But still, compared to apartments and row houses, lower density, lower concentration. And then finally, you have a single family detached residence where you have one family living in their own building. And so that is what we're going to see more out in the suburbs. So is this the way that it's always been? Not necessarily. Let's take a look at change over time. All right. So similar concept that we just looked at a couple slides ago. This is looking at population density and distance away from the central business district. In 1900, the population density in the CBD was very, very high because at that point, there's not a lot of private transportation. There's not a lot of personal automobiles yet. Still very, very expensive. So normal people are not able to afford it yet. All right. So most people had to live in the CBD because that's where they worked, that's where they stayed, and that was where it was the most affordable. All right. Now, by 1950, we start to see some changes here. Personal automobiles, more affordable housing out in the suburbs. And so we're starting to see a shift away from the CBD. Still fairly high population density in the CBD, but we see that bubble start to shift. Okay? By the time we hit the 2000s, suburbanization has widely taken place. We've seen the interstate highway system come to fulfillment. We see personal automobiles be at a level that is quite affordable for most Americans. And so now as we start to get into our different patterns of land use, what's going to be important is that in 1900 and even in the 1950s, there was a single central business district. But now, as cities have continued to grow, especially in North America, we're moving away from a monocentric model and more towards polycentric models. More than one business district. And so that's part of the reason for that bubble. So that second bump that you see in the 2000s, we're going to talk about that as we start to look at different models of land use. Now, the last little bit of fun that we're going to have tonight is looking at patterns that exist with regards to different people, different housing units in relationship to urban areas. And that is where the tapestry segmentation comes in. Hey, and I actually have a copy of this this poster in my room, so feel free to take a look at it next time you're in class. The tapestry segmentation is a resource that was created by ESRI, which is like one of the leading GIS companies, probably the leading GIS company in the United States. And it was trying to identify consumer market based on a lot of different data. And so essentially what they created were 67 distinct market segments. So here's just a small snapshot of 5 of them. And so according to ESRI, quote, tapestry segmentation combines the who of lifestyle demography with the where of local geography to create a classification model with 67 distinct behavioral market segments. And so if you take a look at the image there, you kind of have to zoom in a little bit. Hey, but if you take a look here, under the lifestyle demography area, they talk about some of the things that are used, like are they urban or rural? Are they married or single? How many kids do they have? What income do they have? What type of employment are they engaged in? What is their level of education? The type of residence, their race or ethnicity are all combined together with also the activities that they're likely to engage in, which then identifies them and segments them so that different services can identify their ideal clientele. And ESRI has done this for the entire country. And on the left there, you can see some of the different life mode summary groups, of which the 67 different market segments fit into. All right. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look at that. Before we do, though, I want to ask you guys, what type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we analyzing this? Because if you're looking at it like, wow, a lot going on here. It's actually below the county scale. So let's zoom in on our neck of the woods to see what it looks like. So we're actually looking at, you can look up the zip code using this, and it's GIS, so you can do different layers and things like that. It's really, really fascinating. Okay. So this is the 89052 zip code, which is where Coronado High School is located. And it allows us to see the largest tapestry segments in our area. So the largest one for Coronado High School is silver and gold. And so I'm going to describe what this looks like. Okay, according to ESRI, it is the most affluent senior market, meaning the richest senior market, so silver and gold. Predominantly single-family owner-occupied homes, mostly older married couples with no children, an average household size of 2.02 people per residence. Well-educated seniors, 44% having college degrees. And then you can see there are other groups as well. It's not all silver and gold. That's just the largest group at 14%. Okay? The bright young professionals is the next largest, tied with In Style. As far as this area for bright young professionals, education completed 36% with some college or an associate's degree and 30% with a bachelor's degree or higher. In Style, characterized by 46% college graduates, 75% with some college education. Characterized by married couples, primarily with no kids, with an average household size of 2.33. So, do you think that this describes the area around Coronado? And, more importantly, the reason that this is created, if you were an industry, if you were a business, what businesses would locate in these areas? if you knew that this was your market demographic, what kind of businesses do you think we would see here? And why? Keep that in mind. We'll talk about it in class. Have a good night, everybody.